Okay, folks, so can you hear us online? Yes.
Wonderful. So I want to talk tonight about, obviously, the topic, the whole series on war, peace, and reconciliation and the emerging challenges and religious responses. And obviously, this is a huge topic, but I want to look at a very, very tiny slice of it. And that is an obscure slice to do with countercultural communities or religious communities and their responses. And I'll probably use those terms interchangeably, but the fact of the matter is that almost all intentional communities that last more than a generation are religious communities, and mostly more high commitment religious communities. There's a direct correlation between religious orders who make more demands on their members' times actually lasting for a longer period. So the hypothesis that I wanted to work on was that during times of peace, countercultural communities provide an enduring mirror by which society can examine its values. And during times of war and persecution, they can provide a stronghold by which society itself can be preserved. Now, I'm not an expert on this topic. I'm certainly not a professor or an academic. I just happen to live in a Christian community called the Bruderhof, and I will be drawing a lot on its 100-year history to explore this topic together. But there's some other great examples. So take Benedict of Nursia, for example. It's very well known, but he, together with his related monasteries, helped preserve the canon of classical writings that are very key to our identity in the West. And it's interesting that at a time when essentially feeding your family and not getting killed by Visigoths was the only thing on people's minds, this group of monks managed to devote a huge amount of time to laboriously copying out texts while having to provide for themselves. And I think it demonstrates the strength of community, that you not only can care for yourself, but you can look out for others. In their case, looking out for society. It's quite interesting that John Hurst pointed out in his book, The Shortest History of Europe, that in many cases, the monks would have been copying out texts that the church would have found heretical at the time, to do with science and other topics like that. And yet, for some reason, they still felt that value of human endeavor, the advancement of science in things like poetry, that they carried on their work. And we are indebted to them to this very day. For instance, we know that Hercules was obviously a real person and things like that. The Mercedarians, a very interesting example as well. The Mercedarians, they're also called the Order of the Blessed Virgin Mary of Mercy, bit of a mouthful. They were founded by Peter Nolasco in about 1203, or when they started their mission. At a time of terrible violence between Europe and North of Africa, between the Muslims and Christians, that they found it in themselves to ransom captives, Christian captives who couldn't afford their own ransoms. I think at that time, getting captured and ransomed was a very normal activity. And obviously many of the poor couldn't afford that. And so an order was created purely to provide those ransoms. So again, a group of Christian monks looking out for those while having to also care for themselves. And 800 years later, they still exist and work around the globe. I think there are about 17 different countries, and they work on issues like modern slavery. They also work on trying to liberate people from the slavery of addictions and other forms of spiritual poverty. So very interesting. Looking to more modern times, the effectiveness of Christian communities. People may remember in 2016, the missionaries of charity in Yemen were attacked by a gunman, probably an Islamic extremist, causing the deaths of 16 people, including 4 of the nuns, the sisters who worked there. They were carrying out very dedicated service. They were caring for elderly people in a home, mostly destitute elderly people in a country that had been, involved in chaos of war for many years, but most specifically for the last 2 years. They had opted to stay there and carry on that service in those terrible times. Pope Francis prayed that this pointless slaughter will awaken consciences lead to a change of heart and inspire all parties to lay down their arms and take up the path of dialogue. He called them the martyrs of indifference, reminding us that it's always easy to ignore conflicts that are far away and that don't impact our lives. And this was a conflict that was quite easy, I think, for us in the West to ignore. But when those nuns were killed, all of a sudden people realized that conflict was going on. Western countries started to take action. And it was because of the sacrificial way that these sisters had decided to live. Many other people had been killed in that conflict already, but nothing hit our news, or very few things hit our news, until 4 sisters gave their life because they wanted to stay true to their calling. Unfortunately, that conflict still carries on today, but at least people in the West started to look at it and started to look at some of the very problematic involvement that our country, for instance, has with Saudi Arabia and the arms trade, all because of 4 sisters who dedicated their lives to peace. Another great example is the 21 Coptic martyrs in Egypt who were beheaded by ISIS. And I don't think anyone can forget the image of them kneeling in front of their captors wearing orange jumpsuits, about to be beheaded. Now, they're not strictly a religious order, but because of the demands of the Coptic faith, these men had lived as such, worshipping together while they were living together and going out as migrant workers to send back money to their families. They were very simple men, and their daily religious observances had given them the strength to stay together, and ultimately the strength to refuse the offer that ISIS made for them to convert. They've all paid the ultimate price for their dedication. ISIS probably thought that their video that they made would drive terror into the hearts of people in the West, but instead they had overplayed their hand massively, and people recoiled against the senseless violence. And actually, if you look back in history, that was a time where ISIS started to lose out, where Western governments came together and decided to really take strong action against ISIS because of this. And it ultimately led to their demise in the Middle East. We published a book on those 21 Coptic martyrs, well worth reading, written by a German man called Martin Moserbach, who went down to Upper Egypt to look at their lives and to try and find out, well, what gave them such strength to act in such a, what we see as a heroic way, they saw was just a normal way of faithfulness. So now I've got to get to the story of the Bruderhof, because it's nice to talk about something that I know without having to research on Wikipedia. So writing a letter to Hitler telling him to forsake his policies of anti-Semitism was never going to be a very popular move in 1933. But it is what our community did. It was a polite letter. It started our beloved Reich Chancellor, Adolf Hitler, and it promised that the Bruderhof, a small band of Christians living in full community with each other, would be obedient to Hitler and his government, so long as that obedience didn't clash with their supreme commitment to Jesus Christ. He enclosed letters that they had written to other government officials, and Eberhard Arnold signed the letter and ended it by saying, "We place these documents into the hands of our beloved Chancellor, for whom we ask God from our hearts that at God's hour he may change from being a wielder of supreme state authority to being an ambassador of the humiliated Christ." Now, Hitler never wrote back. We know that he knew of the Bruderhof, and unfortunately, he never took up the challenge of turning his life to Christ, as history shows. But a very small group of pacifists stood up against him. On November 12th, there was a plebiscite in Germany where every German was asked if they supported the policies of the Nazi government. 95% of Germans answered yes. To answer no was very simply choosing to die. Members of the Bruderhof instead wrote a statement on their ballots. They wrote, "My conviction and my will bid me stand by the gospel and for the discipleship of Jesus Christ, the coming kingdom of God, and the love and unity of the church." 4 days later, 140 soldiers surrounded the Bruderhof and at gunpoint interviewed the members, searched the property, confiscated records and books, and then left. Interestingly, they confiscated all the books with red covers, because obviously books with red covers are communist books, so you can't judge a book by its cover. But even they noticed what they later said was a strange unity among those they questioned. Everyone gave the same answers when they were questioned on matters of faith. And these were all sorts of people. We had architects, craftsmen, we had peasants, we had very intellectual people and people who worked in universities. And they all gave that same answer together, enough so that soldiers at gunpoint noticed. Eberhard Arnold wrote to the local officials afterwards and thanked them for their interest in the Bruderhof, but bemoaned that they hadn't spent enough time actually listening to our vision. At that point, persecution was stepped up, and on December 5th, the Fulda school inspector showed up. The children answered his questions well in math, geography, and history, but when he asked them to sing a Nazi song, they didn't do quite so well. In fact, they didn't know it at all. And neither could they answer questions such as where Hitler was born or what he had possibly done for the German people. So they failed that fantastically. The school was closed down and Nazi teachers were ordered to start real lessons in the new year. When the Nazi teachers arrived, the children had gone. We had moved them to a safe house in Liechtenstein. But in 1937, then 17 years after the Bruderhof started, the Nazis had had enough. They dissolved the Bruderhof and forced all members to leave the country immediately. They probably had wanted to send us to a concentration camp, but there was 2 Canadians on the property on the morning that the Nazis raided. They were from the Hutterite tradition, some may know, and it unnerved them. And so instead of us being shipped off to our deaths, we were given 2 days to leave the country permanently. The youngest baby was just 2 days old. So what gives a bunch of normal people, farmers, builders, academics, parents, the strength to resist both psychologically and physically the might and ideology of the Nazis? And this was the same ideology that swept along many the established church and the free churches as well, many other Christian movements, and lots of other idealistic people were all swept up. The youth movement, for instance, was swept up by the power of the Nazi ideology. It sounded so good. It was going to give them jobs and hope and a vision for the future again, but then led arguably to the most terrible war in human history. I believe the way in which you choose to live may have a very big impact on your ability to resist evil such as this. So I'm going to look at that and use the Bruderhof as an example, not because there wasn't other brave resistors, but simply because I know the history and the life of the Bruderhof the best. So the Bruderhof began in 1920, a theologian named Eberhard Arnold, his wife Emmy, and their children and a couple other adults had decided that talking about God's coming kingdom wasn't enough. They had to try and put at least some of it into practice, and they felt that sharing their possessions would be a good starting place. They had read the Bible, and it does talk in Acts 2 and in Acts 4, but this is what the first disciples did. They moved from Berlin, from a fairly middle-class background, into a tiny little village called Zanitz, way in the backwoods of Germany. This was in a Germany, of course, with very strict class structures, religious structures at the time. Many idealistic young people came to join them. It was a time of change in Germany. They had just experienced the end of World War II, huge economic destruction of the country. And so many people started to join. In fact, about 250 people joined in the end before the Nazis expelled us. Germans, English people, people with Jewish heritage, tramps, single women who were pregnant, orphans, people who were outcast from society, or people who were just had a different vision of society, all came. Some stayed, some left, but the community started to grow. And those who joined were fiercely dedicated to building up a life of brotherhood. They lived in poverty, but decided that was a price worth paying for the unity that they were experiencing every day and the purpose that they felt in life. They had already given up everything to build the community. So resisting Hitler was not as hard for those who still had much to protect. And I think one of the great advantages of community is that when you don't personally own things, then you don't personally feel a need to protect them. And maybe you can be bolder or take more risks. After the expulsion from Nazi Germany, the community fled to England, where they settled in the Cotswolds. Again, they were desperately poor. The community started to attract new members, though. Thousands visited and hundreds joined. We were only in England for 6 years, but war was looming and pacifists were hated. There was a lot of local persecution. But people who were desperate to find a different way of life came and joined the community at that point. People like my wife's 4 grandparents all came as single people. They found their way to the Cotswold Bruderhof. They wanted to live a way where these were people who felt that war was wrong, but they wanted to devote themselves to a positive solution. Many people after World War I joined things like the Peace Pledge Union and decided that they would never go to war again. Many people at that time said, we'll never have another war in Europe. And after a very short amount of time, another war was looming. They wanted to try and go to the root cause of that and find a solution for that. And they felt that building a society where your class, your background, the school you went to didn't define who you were was one way to do that. Unfortunately, being German in England at that time was very unpopular, and half of our members were Germans. So we were labeled as spies, and local boycotts were organized against us. We were a farming community and couldn't sell our produce. A member of parliament asked in the House of Commons why we still existed, why we hadn't simply been expelled. And you can see, unfortunately, that obviously we like to look at wars as being sometimes more one-sided. The fact of the matter was, we were, even though we were welcomed as refugees at the beginning into England, animosity quickly rose against us, and some of the persecution was quite terrible. And some of the ways that German people, both in our community and in the population at large, which was treated, was, very, very unfortunate. But still, people came. We have another book we published. It was actually published. Well, sorry, we don't publish it. It was published by a man called Ian Randall, a Baptist historian, called A Christian Peace Experiment, about our time in the Cotswolds. It makes a fascinating book. The best rumor ever that went around the local area was that we were building a submarine in a pond on our property. No one figured out what we would do with the submarine when it was completed. We did have a pond, but unfortunately, no submarine. Eventually, the persecution became so much that we had to leave the country. And we managed to get exit permits, and the entire community made the dangerous crossing just as war was breaking out to Paraguay in South America, dodging German U-boats. Every boat we traveled on was later sunk in the war, but not one member from Nazi Germany all the way through to Paraguay died. One of those people who traveled to Paraguay was Maureen Byrne. She was a highly educated woman who risked estrangement from her family and gave up a very privileged life of comfort to come and join a poverty-stricken group of seekers working on a farm, who then had to board a boat to Paraguay, which might as well have been the other side of the moon. Many people today probably can't locate Paraguay on a map. And believe me, if you try and send a letter to Paraguay, it may arrive at some point in the distant future. It is still a very interesting country. We have a little community there still. But to move there en masse, to settle in the middle of the jungle, to literally cut down trees and build houses was something that people at that time from very middle-class backgrounds were deciding to do. It's an amazing life decision that they made. This is what Maureen Byrne said. She said, "We must always be ready to step out into the unknown at the call of God, as Abraham did. Let us be a pilgrim church on the move, trusting God to lead us where he wants." So I was privileged to know Maureen when she was in her 90s still in America, and she was still faithful to her call. The Bruderhof spent 20 years in Paraguay. They were very difficult years, and then moved up into North America, and from there back around the world. So we now have communities in North America, South America, England, Australia, Germany, South Korea, and Australia. Did I mention Australia? Austria, Australia, both places. About 3,000 people all told, trying to live out a life of discipleship, gladly sharing what we have with each other. Where my wife and I live in East Sussex, and our children, we have about 300 people. You can imagine it like a small village. For those in the room, there's a picture of one of our worship meetings outside there in the middle of our community. So we have a workshop, we have a school, we have a farm, a garden. We eat together once a day. Single people have a family to live with. Older people are cared for by people who love them. No one is paid, and everyone's work and contributions are valued the same. So I'm not sure if anything I've said has fulfilled the hypothesis that I set out at the beginning, but I'll just run through some points, and then hopefully we can debate them and you can ask questions And like I said, I'm not an academic. This is not something I study. It is something that I try to live instead. So in times of war and persecution, we stood up against the Nazi Germany, a Nazi government, and then as a group decided rather to die than to go along with the evils being advanced. So many people, unfortunately, I don't blame them. When a gun is being pointed at you, it is difficult to stick to your commitments. Many Christians would have wanted to take the stand that the Bruderhof and a few others did. But the normal structure of most churches doesn't give people the security to make that sort of decision. On a religious community, you have more of a decision, of a feeling that we're all in together, we can make a decision, we have each other's backs, and even to the point of death, we can still trust each other. The Bruderhof, like other religious orders, has very high trust between our members, at least that's what we aspire to, and very high commitment as well. And those two things go hand in hand. And although the Nazis ultimately closed the Bruderhof, while it existed, it gave daily witness to how society should be structured. This is, in racial harmony, peace, caring for the vulnerable. We included people in our community that the Nazis hated. And I don't know, at that time, it's very difficult to know, did that affect anyone or not? But at least in a time of incredible darkness and spiritual poverty, there was an example of how society should be. Because, in a time of great evil, not everyone is evil. And there were many people in Germany who wanted to do the right thing. And I would hope that that example gave them at least some courage, some hope that society once again could be returned to normal, as it indeed has been. We safeguarded our children's minds from Nazi ideology by running our own schools, and then by moving children to a safe location when that was no longer possible. Many would have wished to do that as well, but it's very difficult to do that by yourself. Even the decision to homeschool your children, for instance, to keep them away from a government ideology that you don't like, well, it was illegal in those days. And as you see, even our school was eventually shut down by the Nazis. Yet, because we all worked as a group together, it was easy enough for us to buy a location in Liechtenstein and to move our children out of the range of what we thought was the ultimate danger that the Nazis pose, the effect on people's minds. Because of the opportunity for daily meetings within the community, the group was better able to discern the lies being advanced by the Nazis. Subjects such as, should we give the Heil Hitler salute? They could be discussed in meetings, and they were, and we decided not to. Again, not many people did. People went along with that because it seemed that that was a good way of keeping out of, trouble, and it wasn't really that bad. But as a group of believers living together every day, even small topics like that can be discussed and were discussed in those days and still are. So in a time of great misinformation, as we experience at the moment, if you have trusted friends to discuss things with, I think it makes it easier. In the Cotswolds, we lived together with English and German, together at a time when there was terrible hostility between these groups. There was Jewish people there as well. So essentially, Dr. Randall's book is called A Christian Peace Experiment, because it was just that. It was an experiment at a time when of huge hostility, that Christians and Germans said, look, we both want to love Jesus, let's do that together. We can put aside our racial differences and do something radical. We took in refugees and orphans at a time of extreme poverty in the Bruderhof. So in these times of persecution and war, we actually tried to model a society that the West finds desirable today. The things that we did then, those were all things that as today's society, now, whatever it is, 60, 80 years later, we think those are the right things to do. Our community was trying to do that at a time when around them, society was breaking down and things like racial hatred was just openly, and even in the UK, obviously we know the story in Nazi Germany, but if you read the newspaper cuttings from around our community at the time, the racial hatred towards Germans was incredible. And what about now, during times of peace? Well, many people are worried about inequality in society. Is it fair when some people in the company are paid many multiples of the lowest paid person? So we try to show society that its ideas of status and how much you earn and the link between those are deeply flawed. We pay each other nothing, and we create the equality that people say they want. So the person who cleans the toilets in our factory is paid the same amount as the person who runs the entire business. And we think that is a wonderful witness to Christian living, to shared living. The people who cook our food for us, we eat communally once a day, and they work in a big commercial kitchen. Typically in England, they would be paid minimum wage or maybe a little bit extra. We choose to pay them the same as everyone else. And believe me, they are regarded much more highly than the person who runs a business, because if they ruin our lunch, that's going to be a big problem. If they cook something delicious, we'll go away happy. The business will take care of itself. Think about disabled people. In England, many disabled people want to work, and yet the employment rate among those with disabilities is tiny. People would like to be more accepting of difference, and yet it's actually quite hard to do in a commercial setting. In our workshop, people come first, and everyone is welcome. If you come and visit, which you're all welcome to do, we have people in wheelchairs, we have people in their 90s, we have people with mental health needs, people with physical disabilities, and they can all work together in a productive way. We make children's toys and furniture. That's our way of supporting ourselves. And by designing products right and designing work spaces right, everyone is welcome within that business structure. It's not so hard then to include people who are different than us if we are less concerned about profit and more concerned about people. Another example, young people today are especially concerned, as we all should be, with the environment and environmental destruction. But it's actually quite hard to take serious action to reduce your carbon emissions or the amount of waste you produce. Some people manage, and all power to them. Many efforts are tokenistic though. But living in community is naturally good for the environment. Like, we waste a lot less food than most people do because we can share it easily. I can run down the hall to my neighbors and give them the extra food that we cooked for dinner. We don't often have extras, my children there, but we grow a lot of our own food together. We buy a lot of food in bulk, and so there's much less plastic packaging waste. We have fewer cars on average than people do. We share a fleet of cars between a whole community. We don't need one for every family. And we're not even an eco-community. So there's a lot of intentional communities that is their focus, and they do a far better job than we do. Many people today, another subject, the NHS take, for example. So many people think today that the NHS has got serious problems. But if you speak to people who work in the hospital, often that is because of a bit of a breakdown of society. There's a lot of people in hospital that shouldn't be in hospital. A lot of people lying in beds that should actually be cared for in a different way, ideally at home or in some sort of secondary care facility. In our community, there's enough structure and enough nurses that the elderly, the infirm, those who are disabled or sick, or people who have just had surgery can return home a lot quicker. Most elderly people don't even go to hospital because we have our own doctors. So you get better health outcomes and far less impact on the public purse. And because no one has a career within the Bruderhof, it is much easier to do something like care for your parents. Like, I don't have to weigh up if taking time off work or changing my hours or changing my job entirely will somehow impact my way of living. I will carry on living regardless of what job I have within the community. There's no such thing as a promotion within the Bruderhof. People do the job that they're assigned to do. Often it's not one they were qualified to. And you don't have to worry about things like career advancement. In fact, I don't think anyone's ever used that word within the Bruderhof. And if they did, everyone would laugh at them. So people hate the divisiveness of our time. It seems to be that, and this is, maybe it's not a modern phenomena, but it seems to be a growing phenomena, that people get pigeonholed into one political box or another. We see that very strongly in America, but also over here as well. So we try to show that an alternative to divisive issues exists. So take the issue of abortion, for instance. Sometimes an issue over here, being a massive issue in America. But rather than take the extremes of both sides of the debate, we simply try to create a place where no woman would ever want to or ever consider having an abortion. And to try to address problems at their root causes is, I think, a particular strength that you can have in community. It's especially true on the subject of peace and reconciliation. And again, as we meet today, we have a war in Europe, there are wars all around the world. And the need for peace and reconciliation in our world is very strong. But war in its basic form is caused by greed, the desire to possess things, or a desire for power. If you take Myanmar, as an example. There's been war there, unfortunately, much of it ignored for many, many decades. The ethnic people there have been horrifically persecuted. Why? They simply live in the wrong place. They live in a place where there is natural minerals, things that people want, and greedy people are willing to clear those people off their land to have access to those minerals, which go into making our smartphones, our computers, and other things like that. So if war is caused by greed and our desire to consume, why aren't we doing more to deal with that in our own lives? And this was very much a founding principle of the Bruderhof. It's great to call for the end of war, but if our desire for possessions makes the chance of ending war very, very remote, shouldn't we be looking at that in our own lives first of all? I think living in a possession-free way is the first step towards building a peaceful world again, and one that the West should be looking at. And the Bruderhof is not alone. If you visit any convent or monastery or similar religious order, you can see these same positive elements happening. So I would say that many people, in conclusion, many people in society sense that the way they live is imperfect. And I'm not saying the Bruderhof is perfect in any way, but if you sense, I think the sense is growing in people now that in a time of serious political turmoil, it's not that the Bruderhof has the answer to these problems. It's just that many of the problems disappear when we stop worrying about money so much and that we try and follow what Jesus said. Jesus directly commanded his followers not to worry about money. And if we simply want to follow those commands, and in doing so, prove that another life, another way of living really is possible. So that is the end of my talk. I'm not sure if it was coherent at all. Hopefully it came across to people in the room and people on Zoom as well. And now I am very happy to take questions. I can take questions about the Bruderhof. I can take questions about other things. And if you ask me complex questions, I'll just default to other much more intelligent people in the room. So I'm not sure how questions how questions work on Zoom. So